Good evening, everyone. My name is Bryce Wakefield. I'm the CEO of the Australian Institute of International Affairs, and I'm pleased to welcome you to tonight's event and to acknowledge that it is taking place on the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, whose elders past, present, and emerging I also acknowledge. I also acknowledge those of you who are tuning in from around the country. Throughout tonight's proceedings, of course, the Q&A function is open, and if you would like to give us a question, you can do so online. There's also an upvote, so if you see upvote function, so if you see a question you like, you can click on it, and if it gets enough votes, it'll rise to the top of the pack, where we will choose to answer it or ignore it. As most of you know by now, the AIIA, which was founded in 1933, was founded by branches that date their formation back to the 1920s. And those branches, including Victoria this year and New South Wales last year, are beginning to celebrate their centenaries. So we are proud to be Australia's longest active institute for international affairs, with branches in every state and territory open to all Australians. And we're also proud to be a membership organisation dedicated to an informed, non-partisan and importantly public debate on the key issues shaping our world. And if you're not a member, you should be, so please do visit our website to sign up. So one of those important issues that I mentioned, and one that we don't always examine as rigorously as we might, and we might do so here given that we are a public organisation, is empathy in politics. Can you just open that door, please, Hebe? Thank you. In recent years, empathy emerged as a defining political message, embraced by leaders like Jacinda Ardern, praised in the leadership style of Barack Obama, and central to Joe Biden's first presidential campaign. It has been lauded as a means to soften division, rebuild trust, and humanize the oft-hardened tone of political life. Yet, as the international landscape shifts once again with the return of Donald Trump to the US presidency and the dismantling of diversity and inclusion initiatives, cuts to foreign aid, and the disruption of global alliances, we're left to ask, does empathy still matter in our politics? It's a question we might ask here in Australia as political parties reevaluate their strategies in the wake of an election. Can empathy meet the demands of 21st century leadership, or is it too easily utilised cynically, dismissed as weakness, or left behind in the race for power? Dr. Claire York, Senior Lecturer at Deakin University's Centre for Future Defence and National Security, explores these issues head-on, drawing on her research into the role of empathy and emotion in leadership, diplomacy and security, and with experience that bridges Westminster, Washington and Canberra. Claire will argue that empathy is not only still relevant, but essential. However, for it to be truly effective, it must be understood not as sentimentality, but as a strategic capability with depth, discipline, and resilience. This timely and forward-looking talk will offer a compelling vision for how emotional intelligence can reshape politics, provided we give it the muscle and momentum to do so. And so with that, I welcome Claire onto the stage.
Thank you so much, Bryce. Thank you to Hebe and all the team at AIIA, and to all of you here. Thank you so much for coming on what seems like a rainy Tuesday evening. It's so lovely to see so many friendly faces in the audience. So as Bryce said, empathy has been an increasingly popular buzzword in politics. We've seen articles in various news outlets extolling its value and its virtue. We've seen people speaking very prominently about it. As an academic, my bookshelf is full of books on empathy and what it means and why it matters. So I know that it's an important concept, but it's also increasingly seen as weak and naive or even dangerous. So I want to talk for the next half an hour or so about, is the age of empathy over? And I'm going to define empathy as an attempt to understand the experiences, perspectives, context, and emotional worlds of others. And for me, it's not just something cognitive. It's not just something you think about. It's also something where we gain a deeper appreciation for people's emotional states. It's about connection, it's about relations, and it's about fostering understanding. And although it can be conflated with compassion and sympathy, I'm going to argue that it's different, albeit I won't get too much into a definition right now, and I will leave that for the question and answers for those who would be interested in it. But this empathy wave in politics can maybe be seen to start in 2006, when Barack Obama, before he became president, spoke about the federal deficit in America not being the most important deficit. There was also an empathy deficit, and he encouraged the students at Northwestern University that he was addressing to consider the lives of others when they went into the world. Since then, Jacinda Ardern has done a lot to increase the popularity of empathy. She spoke just last week at Yale about why it is still important. But she was speaking at Davos about its importance about 10 years ago. And in Christchurch in New Zealand at the time of terrorist attacks, she responded with a humility and an understanding for the victims that was championed around the world as being a sign of how we could do security and politics differently, by understanding those who'd been affected, by leading with empathy. In the United States in 2020, when Joe Biden won the presidency, he walked on stage with a giant screen behind saying the people have chosen empathy. For the election campaign, he was the empathy candidate. The campaign platform championed how he had very good relations with the Amtrak drivers. He spoke to them regularly. He understood them. He was helping a young boy with a stutter because he really felt and knew what that was about. And so empathy was very much part of his ability to connect with others. And it was seen then as something that we should value. I noted as well just a few weeks ago, watching the election how much Anthony Albanese, on winning the new leadership of Australia, commented so much on the ideas of togetherness and overcoming division and understanding other people. So these themes of empathy are still alive and well. And yet more recently, this concept has also been tested. The strength of these kinds of leadership have been called into question, as well as the success of the approach. And it's notable that during the COVID pandemic in 2020, although a lot of the leaders were praised for their empathy, for showing care for constituents and for their publics, people like Jacinda Ardern, leaders like Sanna Marin in Finland, they all then encountered tests to their leadership. They did not win re-election. They were seen in sometimes as not being as strong as maybe they could have been. And as Bryce mentioned, only 100 days in, and President Donald Trump in the United States has done a lot to dismantle DEI and to hollow out a lot of the understanding that exists within governments. Most notably, on the podcast with Joe Rogan, Elon Musk spoke about how empathy was suicidal and responsible for the collapse of Western civilization. And this is something that's echoed in other quarters. So it's coming under fire. And so it's quite understandable that maybe people are questioning its relevance and its value in our politics. But I'm going to argue that far from being over and far from being despondent, empathy is evolving, and it's even more needed now than ever. But in order for it to be effective, we have to think differently about it. It's not something soft or weak, but it's actually an integral part of vibrant democracies and resilience. It's part of our civic life, and it should be a part of our future. But we have to give it renewed energy, and we have to approach it in a different way. And I will declare my hand for those who maybe have not guessed already. I am a pragmatic idealist. So I have a vision that we can be better, we can do better, we are capable of change. But I've worked in politics and policy for long enough to know that that is not easy, and that the challenges are high and they are hard. So I hope that this can kind of capture some of that tension, some of the challenges, but also some of the potential. It will be a bit of a run through. I do have a book coming out that will look at this in more detail. There's details around the room. It should be out later this year in Australia in December. And I'm more than happy to dig into any of the questions you might have in the Q&A when I finish. But I'm going to look at why empathy is vulnerable. Why is it unpopular and being tested? Why is it needed even more than ever? And what can we do to re-energize it and put it into practice? So there is evidence really to say that empathy has not been successful. So I can understand why people like Elon Musk maybe critique its capacity for change. When we look at the world and we open the newspapers or we go on the news online every day, we can see evidence of failures of compassion, failure of humanity, and failures of empathy. We're seeing right now continued tragedy in Gaza, thousands of children and families starving, continued conflict. We're seeing as well a lot of underreported conflicts that are not receiving attention in Sudan, in Yemen, and other places. We're seeing as well more close to home that there's huge inequalities and disparities in wealth, in access to opportunities and resources. So it's quite natural that people would question whether or not it's serving us and whether or not it will be helpful. Given the scale of the challenges we face, it can be natural that empathy is a little bit too small to really do the heavy lifting, that it's not enough to be able to meet the demands of what we need. And such weakness is often conflated with misplaced kindness, that actually we shouldn't be kind. We need hard-nosed realism. We need to put interests first. We need to prioritize the bottom line. And it's interesting that just last month in The Spectator, there was an article about Jacinda Ardern's empathy being an empty politics of kindness. It was all style and no substance. And this is a criticism that's often labeled against those who champion empathy. And it's notable it's often women against whom this is championed. It was maybe a biased piece, but it's notable that we want to see empathy, but we also want to see strength. We want there to be something stronger to back it up. And another reason for concern is perhaps because this preference for empathy as style over substance can mean that it can seem performative. So people stop trusting it. If everybody talks about the value of empathy, if everybody knows that it's the political buzzword that gets you support and likes an audience to support you, then maybe it doesn't actually mean what it should mean. And so we need to then think about empathy as being far more than a performance, as being something more substantial, being something that actually can make the change and address the systemic and structural inequalities and challenges that we face. I think part of this is that empathy is something that takes a lot of time. We want to have things that are quick solutions. And that isn't always easy in our political context. One of the big criticisms that we're seeing in America right now to empathy is coming from the evangelical Christian right. And they are arguing in books and publications that empathy is actually a toxic trait. It's leading people to care about things that they shouldn't. For example, trans rights, women's rights, equal rights for men and women. And actually, they'll argue as well that women are susceptible to empathy, and therefore maybe they don't need to be as central to the political system because they make flawed choices, because they're too guided by their emotions. It's not surprising that this is not something I agree with, but it's interesting that this idea is really growing right now in America, that empathy is something that should be avoided and withdrawn from the political space because care can be distortive. It makes us look after and consider the wrong things when actually we need to be thinking about family values, traditional values, what really matters. A further critique is that it's being weaponized, and we do see this. In some of my broader work on strategy, I look at different ideas of empathy, and one of them is this idea of how it can create in-groups versus out-groups. So empathy can very much be used to say, I care about you, and I know what you fear for. I know your concerns and your interests, and this group here is partly responsible for that. And so empathy can be used as a way to create that division, to deepen the divides that exist within society. It can be manipulative and instrumentalized. And so people see it and they say, well, actually, is it really serving us? Because it's not bringing us closer together. It's not helping us see what the other side thinks or feels or see them as equals. And so I would argue this is empathy, And this is a facet of it, just as concepts of power and security can have different dimensions. Power can be used to oppress people. It can be used to lift them up. Security can be used to legitimize the use of force, or can be used as a way to find other ways to protect people, to promote human security. So view empathy as something that can have these different facets. But for it to have the substance that I spoke about, it needs to have a moral component. It needs to be connected with a sense of what is required for good societies, what is needed to create more justice, more value, more well-being within our societies, a vision of what is better for more people, and that involves more people. I have not heard the Red Dwarf theme tune in a while. That's a good ring tune. Oh, it's great. Takes me back. So for empathy to have substance, it has to have a moral component. There's also a challenge that it's incomplete. And this, I think, is why other people maybe lose a bit of faith with empathy. Part of the challenge right now with our politics, especially when we have populist leaders who are gaining increasing power and increasing support, is that they also are using this empathy. They're showing concern for parts of society that feel left behind by the traditional left and by the center. And there's a failure in politics of certain quarters, mainly the left and the center, I think, to really identify and understand where some people are being left behind in their vision of progress. That actually by talking and championing certain ideals, it's not inclusive enough of those who don't fully understand the benefits that those ideals might bring, and who are not immediately advantaged by the changes to society, who are not seeing their wages increase, who are seeing the advance of technology take their jobs and take opportunities and livelihoods from them. And so empathy can be incomplete. It's not including everybody. And so people are feeling left behind by it and want to see far more. But we cannot address the demands and the needs of a vibrant democratic society without it, and without a willingness to engage in a deeper appreciation for the complexity of societies, the complexity of different people's needs, and for the diversity of experiences and backgrounds and perspectives. So why is it needed? Even as I've explained some of the ways in which it's not quite working, I think that politics is not working as it should. We've kind of lost sight of what the purpose of politics is, which should be to serve people and to create better societies for those people. We're seeing growing divisions within society. And it's interesting to note that actually the ABC released figures before the election that showed that maybe Australia is not quite as polarized as other parts of the world, but people are feeling more ambivalent and more discouraged by the state of it. We're finding that increasingly in our politics, we stay within our own bubble. We are more likely to see people who think the way we do and to have our own ideas and our biases reinforced. It's far harder to look across the aisle and to see, what do those people who disagree with me really think? Where is that coming from? To be curious about why it is that they aren't seeing the same ideas of progress or the same vision of success as we do. There's also growing mistrust, and this seems to increase year on year. The Edelman releases a trust barometer every year, and it seems to show a growing decline. There's also OECD figures that show that trust is decreasing in democracies around the world. Democracy is increasingly struggling. Freedom House noted in 2023 that the number of democracies in trouble is increasing. So there's problems with our politics that empathy needs to address, that it needs to get a hold of. And there's also increased disengagement. I know I'm talking to an Australian audience, and so you have far more engagement with compulsory voting than maybe we do back where I'm from in the United Kingdom. But people are still feeling left behind. They're not feeling like politicians are talking to them. They don't feel like the systems and the services designed to help them are really engaging with them. They're feeling left behind. They don't trust politicians, and politicians are notoriously among the most mistrusted of professions within our societies. But they're also seeing increased divisions in the relations between countries. Bipartisanship is breaking down. And we saw this especially in the Indigenous voice in 2023. I think there's another problem in that there's a blur between left and right. People aren't always sure where people sit on the political spectrum. Sometimes it feels like the left and the right at the extremes become closer to one another. So we're not dealing with the same kind of political groups that we once did, and no one's really explaining where they can find their community. The rise of independence, especially in the Australian election, I think is testament to the fact that people want more connection to local politicians, to people who are really championing issues that matter to them in their local areas. Another reason why it's needed is it's integral to vital democracy. You cannot have pluralistic, diverse societies without empathy that seeks to bring people together, to have the hard conversations, to have the dialogues, and to encourage people to bring their diverse views and experiences together to create something better. So empathy in politics is about accommodation and inclusion. It's also about fostering more listening and understanding. We cannot fix the problems today unless we're able to understand what is really going on. And as I mentioned, with these increased problems of division and disengagement, empathy in politics is critical to fostering belonging and engagement. People want to feel like they are seen, they want to feel they're heard, and they want to feel like they matter. And that is where empathy in politics can really play a role, by saying to people, whether that's politicians, whether it's community leaders, whether it's people involved in policy making, we want to know what you think, we want to know what matters, and we want to know what you're concerned about, because we want to find ways to address them that take you with us. And I do find, and I have found through my interviews, through people that I follow online, through people that I engage with, that a lot of people are seeking this out. People are hungry for belonging. They're hungry for community. They want to be part of something closer to home and something that means something to them. And the challenge right now in our societies is we're increasingly atomized and disconnected. We spend a lot of our lives online, but we're not getting out there. We're not meeting the people who think differently, but who at the end of the day are just as human and just as valuable as we consider ourselves and our communities to be. Another reason why it's so important is because it is reflective. Empathy for me in politics forces people to reflect on what we want, on what we have done, on what we can do, and on what we've done in the past that maybe has left legacies that have caused harm and pain to certain people and groups. This can mean bringing in those who've been marginalized, whether that is minority groups, women, LGBTQ+ communities. Can also mean recognizing historic failures. And for me, as a Brit, I would love there to be a much richer conversation in the United Kingdom about the legacies of empire and about the harms that that has done to people around the world, as well as actually what happened in that period. What is the history in a far more nuanced way that appreciates the complexity? I think here in Australia, there's also a real opportunity that was unfortunately missed slightly with the Indigenous voice to talk far more about what is the history of Australia and what is that meaning for today, and how do we bring more people into that space to have a conversation about where we go in the future. There is also this very strategic dimension that Bryce mentioned. And I find that for those who are maybe more immune to the other arguments that I have made, the strategic argument is maybe sometimes more compelling. If you want to create lasting change, if you want more longer-term solutions, if you want to actually not constantly have to change ship every single time someone else is elected, you need to bring empathy into the process to really hear and listen to what citizens want and need, and to build them into the process so that there is an investment in the outcomes. We have to be attuned to how political ideas at the heart of government and policy departments play out on the front line. It's all very well and good to have a great idea for education. My mum used to be a teacher, and I would find that the government would often introduce measures and didn't necessarily relate to the amount of work that she would be doing at home and the weekends that she would sometimes have to spend marking, because they didn't fully capture the nature of what it is to be on the front line teaching a class of 20+ students. The same with healthcare. It's all well and good to have numbers about how the waiting time for beds is reduced, but actually, are people experiencing healthcare in a way that is beneficial to their well-being, that makes them feel like their health is important? So we cannot fix these problems unless we're engaged in the solution. I think there's a real strategic dimension then. If you want that longer-term outcome, you've got to take people with you in the process. And empathy also builds trust. this very process of saying to people, I see you and I hear you, helps to build that relation of trust. That means that people feel more engaged, more connected, but also that they're more likely to accept when there are inevitable failures or mistakes, which is going to happen in politics. It is never going to be a perfect science, and it is never going to be immediate. We can never deliver something and have it roll out and it be perfect. And if people trust that you have their best interests at heart, they're probably more likely to stay with you while you tweak and refine and make sure it's a little bit better. So I think we don't fix the problems unless we get better at coming together, leaning into difference, and having the very constructive but difficult conversations. I don't think it's comfortable. And so with all this said, I want to acknowledge that empathy is not easy. For those who say that it is a weakness, that it's soft, that it's naive, it takes courage and it takes effort and it takes patience and hard work and time and investment. And that's really why I think we struggle with it, because it's not something that we want to do. It makes demands on us. It has costs that come with it. And it means that we have to accept that our own worldviews, our way of viewing things, engaging with people, comes into question. We're forced to reflect on ways in which maybe we don't have all the answers. Maybe the ideal that we want is not ironclad. But we need lasting change and not short-term fixes. So for my final section, really, where do we go from here? If it's not over, then how do we re-energize it? I have a lot of ideas, but I have limited time, so I will give you 3. Firstly, we need to think differently about what it means and the difference that it brings. And for me, this is very much about moving from empathy as a leadership trait to considering it as part of a political ecosystem. A lot of the examples I gave at the start, Jacinda Ardern, Joe Biden, Barack Obama, are all great ideas and examples of leaders who demonstrate empathy. But if we rely on leaders alone, then we are left shortchanged, because if we wait for them to transform our politics, we could be waiting a while. Politics is a fickle beast, and they alone cannot change it. It also makes us passive. It means we are dependent on other people to realize the change that we want with our politics. And it's also not sustainable. It means that the moment they leave office, we then have to fill that gap. And the person who follows them may not, in fact, probably will not have the same kind of ideas. So part of this is a recognition as well that the capacity of our leaders is constrained by the systems and structures of government. I worked in the British Parliament for 3 years, and I found that it was not that the people I worked with lacked empathy. It was that there was only certain limitations and restrictions to what they could do. And I know now from the interviews that I've done with politicians, there's one at the back of the room as well that I've spoken with, they all enter politics because they want to make a difference. They want to understand people and understand the value of empathy within that. And so for me, it's about recognizing that empathy is there already, but we need to build it into more of an ecosystem. We need to recognize there's no quick fixes or easy solution. It takes time and care and investment, as I've already said. And it's particularly difficult when you're talking about politics, because where do you direct it? You're trying to deal with a constituency or a state or a province or a territory with thousands of people in it. You cannot possibly empathize with all of them. You need to exercise good judgment. You need to be able to determine where it's most usefully applied, and you need to be able to communicate to those who maybe will not see that your result benefits them. You need to still be taking them along in the process. Empathy is not rewarded by the system as well. As much as we want to see it in our politicians, they're often not rewarded for it. There's a short-term imperative to win seats, to maintain popularity, to not fall out with people who are leading your own party. And you want to ultimately enact your own political agenda. And that's going to be disadvantaged if you're seen as caring for the wrong kinds of people at the wrong time. So that's why instead of thinking solely about leaders, we should think about this idea of an ecosystem. What does it mean for the systems and structures of politics, for the culture of our politics, for how we talk about others who disagree, for how things are achieved and realized within political systems, for the media and what it covers, and for society and how we engage with each other. So I would encourage that when we think about this space, it's about the everyday. It's not politics as our parliament, as our legislative or executive branches. It's about how it infuses all of our lives in the everyday, from access to healthcare, from how much is invested in defense to who has a voice and a seat around the table. And by recognizing this, it gives us far greater agency. The second point of my suggestions is to reconsider what political success looks like. I find I get frustrated when so much of political commentary focuses just on GDP and the economy. These matter. As we saw, Albanese's win in the Australian election was a large part because he spoke to the economic situation. But we also need to move beyond just categorizing the success of a country and a community based on outputs and profits and GDP. You can, as I said, you can say that waiting times are shorter, but if people do not feel they're getting what they deserve, then it doesn't really look like success. So we need to think differently about measures of cohesiveness, what we determine as resilience, the ability of societies to withstand challenge, and to feel like they're part of a community and belong together. We need to be investing far more in the longer term elements of building communities, in extracurricular activities, in spaces for civic engagement, for people to come together in libraries and sports centres. There's also some really interesting ideas that we find as well close to home around thinking differently about the economy. Someone who really inspires me, who is local, is Catherine Trebek, who works on well-being economies. And this idea that's also connected to the idea of donor economics by Kate Raworth about distributive, regenerative economies that help people thrive. How do we think differently about the systems so that they work for us and not against us? So it's more about looking holistically and comprehensively. Does policy make people feel seen? Does it make them feel safe? Does it make them feel supported? Not does it make society or the country richer? We need to be asking different kinds of questions. The final point is to empower citizens to be more active. We have to be agents in creating the change we want in politics. We should all be doing empathy, just as we should all be doing politics. Part of this is about encouraging more participatory democracy. There's, again, in Canberra, some great people doing work on this at the Centre for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance, who are really looking at how you can utilize citizens' assemblies or different forms of participatory democracy to bring people in early. They're not perfect systems, they're not perfect answers, but it's a way of trying to get more people involved in designing the solutions that they need, because for the most part, people in local communities often know what is most needed and what is best for them, rather than having people at the top tell them. So how can we engage that more effectively? It also involves a more honest dialogue about what is involved in politics and the complexity and trade-offs, letting people know that there are not simple solutions and neat answers. And if there are, you should probably not trust those who are peddling it. So we need to be leaning into our power, leaning into our communities, investing in being a part of different aspects, whether that's after school clubs, school councils, community initiatives. It's also about, in our everyday relations, getting curious about different people who think differently, who do things differently, having debate respectfully with boundaries, but able to agree to disagree, and finding common ground. And I like the idea of Loretta Ross, who talks about calling people in rather than calling people out, that when we're trying to set the boundaries and the parameters for discussion of our politics, we avoid shame, we avoid humiliation, we create space to move through the things that we find problematic without casting people out. So to conclude, I know maybe this is a different approach to empathy in politics than just looking at leaders, but far from thinking that empathy is over, I'd argue that it's only just evolving. It's totally natural that we feel like it is challenging and that it's had its day and that politics feels dispiriting. I wake up every day frustrated and saddened by the state of the world and the news, but I also think that there's a huge amount of hope for change, for doing things different, for believing that actually empathy is yet to have its moment, and that we're going to get closer there by leaning into each other, into our communities, and into new ways of doing politics and new ways of engaging. Humans have always been tenacious and we've always been resilient. I work with defense and security professionals, so I know this to be true. Why would we want to have politics that does not value kindness or care or understanding? It's exactly what we need. But it's also not enough to have it on its own. We need political courage. We need leaders who can do what is unpopular but necessary. We need public will and a far greater public conversation about the kind of politics we want and how we want it to be achieved and realized. This requires vision and creativity, means thinking differently, and also accepting it's not an overnight job. No one leader can come in an administration and deliver this. It has to be a longer term, far more sustainable mission, which requires patience and discomfort and sitting in diversity and accommodating difference. But I'd argue we can't navigate what we're dealing with right now without it. It's really on us to make it a vital and integral part of our politics. So it's a very brief run through. Thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to questions.
Okay, thank you. Hebe, can you just make sure that people are hearing me? So if you just bear with us, we're seeing if the people online can hear us. Can they? No? Okay. Okay, I'll fix it later. Well, when we get it fixed, could you please make sure you speak into the microphone and so that people at home will hear us. The little dial on the black box in there. Press 2 and then switch the dial. Look, that was a great talk. I think it's a great talk because we as an organization were founded in a sense to input public attitudes and perspectives into international affairs, and there is a bit of a narrative. We were founded after the end of the First World War. There's something of a narrative that the people who across the world founded organizations like these did so because they were tired of generals controlling everything without listening to peoples, as it were. Didn't really work so much in the ensuing decades, but maybe we'll get there at the end. I do wonder, though, when I think of strategic empathy, and I mean, obviously you're far more well-versed in it than me, I think of it from an international relations perspective as understanding your international partner, whoever you may be dealing with, whether your enemy or your friend or something like that, in a diplomatic sense, or maybe in a strategic sense, if you're going to war with them, you know, what are they thinking? How do we appeal to their publics, et cetera, et cetera? Do you think, I mean, you've given us a raft of statistics to show that empathy within the domestic sphere has been declining of late. Do you think there's a connection between the two realms, if you like, the domestic and the international, that we're getting worse at understanding each other internationally as we become worse at understanding each other domestically?
Oh, I'm trying to figure out on which metric I might judge that. So I do make this distinction between the kind of empathy I've just spoken about now, which is more in the political space, and then strategic empathy, which is very much more in the international relations diplomacy, where it is about trying to understand empathy with that strategic implication for improving foreign policy, for improving a country's international standing. And for me, it's still vital. And one of the challenges is it encounters the same frictions that we find it hard to use empathy with those people that we don't like or we don't agree with. But actually, especially when it comes to strategic empathy, when it's about how do we understand China? How do we understand Russia? Countries where there's an animosity or a tension with, or an outright conflict with. People see empathy as a concession or a sign of agreement, whereas actually what you're trying to do is understand, well, what does this country, what do the leaders of this country think and feel, and how is that shaping their engagement? What are they looking for within this situation? What are their motivations for action? And you can't be an effective strategist and diplomat or policymaker if you're not willing to engage in that, because you then end up working behind a lot of narrow assumptions that maybe do not have the nuance and complexity needed to do justice to the understanding of the other. And it also hinders the kind of relations that might help you get that understanding. So I view the domestic politics slightly different to the strategic, but I think you still need to get better. And part of it is that we don't have enough leaders who are visionary or courageous enough to do the difficult job of saying, how might they be thinking about this right now? It's far easier to cast an enemy image and just not talk to people, but actually to go through the process of trying to understand where they're coming from, even though you disagree. And I did my PhD on Nixon and China and how he opened up to the country. And he was very clear on saying, this is how China works. And along with Kissinger, they would say, look, we understand China, this is how it works, but we don't agree with them. We have very different systems of governance, very different economic models, but we recognize the need for this rapprochement, for bridging with China. So I think it's possible for leaders to do, but it seems hard in the current environment.
Good. Okay, if you do have a question, raise your hand. Tell us who you are. Speak into the microphone so folks at home can hear. Desmond.
Hello, Desmond Woods, AAA councillor. Thank you very much for a very insightful and interesting presentation. I think I'm hearing you talk about what I call social capital. There's national capital and there's social capital, and at any one time, a nation needs to have both. You're probably familiar with the fact that at the turn of the 20th century, Australia and New Zealand became the social workshops of the world. Old age pensions, female suffrage, extension of male suffrage, the beginning of the idea that the state had a role in helping people not fall through the cracks and fall too far. The First World War, of course, was a challenge to that, but in some ways it stimulated things like female suffrage throughout the world, including Britain. Then, of course, you have the tragedy of the Depression, the Great Depression, which echoed the tragedy of the 1890s, and people had to cohere. They had to come together because they had so little. And the impoverishment of the Western world after 1929 is important in understanding what happens next. The Second World War, of course, had an entire generation, or those that survived it, coming home to the democracies saying, well, we're going to look after each other. We're going to look after those who didn't come home, their widows and children, and we're going to set up the NHS, we're going to extend Medicare, Medicaid. All these things were part of what I'm talking about, social capital. John and I, sitting here, probably the oldest people in the room, are baby boomers. We were brought up by Depression boys and girls, people who'd been through that Depression. We belong to Rotary. Trying to get anyone to join Rotary now in a younger age group is hard because people have had no experience of being part of something that is voluntary and that is designed to help other people without thought of reward for yourself. What I'm getting to is the point that the generations that have followed us, it's not their fault, have had very little experience of this communality, which were forced upon people by the lack of wealth in society in general, that if you didn't share, nobody had anything very much. The experience of the Second World War cannot be underestimated, should not be underestimated, because it's absolutely central to the way in which the next generation were brought up. There has been no repetition of that. What we see is outbreaks of communality. We're seeing one at the moment in Tyree, where people are out there helping their neighbors with their stock and their animals, finding hay. And our Rotary Club just gave $10,000 to help today. But I don't quite see where we're going to get the epochal experience, which is going to renew that sense of communality. And I'm not altogether sure I want to see that because it's been so often associated with impoverishment and war, neither of which we need. But social capital is, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, what you're talking about. Can you comment on that?
I mean, social capital's part of it, but it's more, I think I'm talking very much about empathy. I mean, social capital is the idea that people like Robert Putnam have spoken about, where looking at how people form civic bonds, but also the kind of the strength of that and the weight of that within societies. I think that's a key part. But what I'm talking about is how do we understand? So maybe to take your point there, I would love to see far more people of your generation going to younger people and saying, how can we help? How do we help with the challenges that you're facing? Because your generation in many ways has benefited as much as you went through very difficult deprivations that
were
we
the
may not
lucky
understand.
generation. We were the ones who
But
came after the war.
But I'd love to see that dialogue where actually it's that cross-generational understanding of how do we use our knowledge and our understanding to bridge this divide, to help realize something different. And I actually find when I talk to activists and people in communities, young people are incredibly innovative. They're doing a huge amount on climate change. They're doing a huge amount to create communities. They maybe look different. A lot of those communities are online. And I think there's an argument that we need to find more ways to bring those communities into our everyday environment, because you build a lot more through that personal connection, that trust, that relationality. But I think there's a way that we bridge that, because we shouldn't go back to the kind of deprivations you were speaking of, or that kind of challenge that people faced. But I also think that we shouldn't deny that actually there's a lot going on, but it's not finding maybe a space for it to be fully realized or given the attention and the space that it deserves. And there's a lot. I mean, young people they're at the forefront of really calling out injustice right now and really calling for change. So how do people of older generations who have power, who have privilege in a way that maybe they don't, especially those who are under the age of who can vote, how do they say, how do we help amplify your voice? How do we help get you out there? So I think that's one way of doing it, to use your social capital to help those who maybe have less of it.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kurt.
Alex.
Alex Bristow from Australian Strategic Policy Institute, ASPI. My question was, and I think you alluded to it already, Bryce, but people who are helping to teach the military, I think you're involved in professional military education yourself, aren't you, Claire? Helping to teach them empathy. Is there ever a sort of an ethical dilemma about what you teach them or how far you go? Because it will be used in some ways as a weapon. I mean, I a very quick anecdote, and I promise it's quick. Michael Battier, who you may not have heard of, he was an anthropologist who I knew when I was at university. He was killed by an IED in Afghanistan. He was deployed in Afghanistan as part of the Human Terrain System, which was a US military project to bring young academic anthropologists out to Afghanistan so they could understand the society that they were helping to rebuild. Now, the American Anthropological Society's decision was that they shouldn't have done that, and they said that they would deregister anybody in the society who participated in that project. Arguably it was defensible that he went out there and risked his life, because he was actually arguably trying to help rebuild Afghanistan. But you sort of face, in some ways, I guess you face these dilemmas because of your involvement in professional military education. So is there a point at which you sort of need to, as someone who's teaching empathy, an anthropologist or otherwise, you need to sort of say, actually, no, that's not where I would go with it, because they're going to use it for the wrong purposes? Yeah,
I mean, I think there's definitely those. I'll probably defer to my those I work with who are on the front lines, because I'm not a military officer. I have not had combat experience, so I'm not as well versed in that reality. But I would say that if you are going to send men and women to another country in order to protect or defend something, or in order to do diplomacy or more effective relations with them, then surely it's a positive thing that they have a better understanding of the nuance and complexity of that country. I mean, part of the challenge with Afghanistan is we go into a country with, I say we, I'm not the one who sent people, I didn't go, but if we go into Afghanistan and you don't understand the nuances of the local area, you don't know how power is diffused, you don't know how societies are organized, there's far greater risk that you will cause harms, that you'll have unintended consequences, and that you'll risk the lives of the men and women that you're sending. And so I know that there is always going to be this tension, and maybe there's a threshold where it does become problematic. But as far as I'm concerned, if you're going to teach diplomats or officers or anyone who's involved in engaging with other countries, the more that they are curious and able to seek out answers that give them a richer and more nuanced understanding of what they're dealing with, the better they will be able to relate to the people on the ground, the more they will understand that the people on the ground probably have the answers that are needed to the solution, and the insight and the wisdom that we lack if we impose ready-made solutions from Canberra or London on them. So I do understand its attention. I think there's a lot of philosophical dimensions to that to unpack, but yeah, thank you.
Claire, hi, my name's Mary Ann Horn. We've we've met briefly before. My question was, how do you try and prevent those who are perceived as having a lack of empathy from setting the new normal? And the reason I ask this question is I'm an aid worker by background. I'm a frontliner. Most of my work involves access negotiations and trying to convince state-armed groups and non-state-armed groups to give access to people who they would rather not see thriving, or communities that they would rather not see striving. And what we've seen is really the backlash since the Ukraine-Russia war, the occupied Palestinian territories, and the Israel-Hamas war, where I've just come back from Myanmar and the earthquake response, and the ripple effect of this perceived lack of empathy and respect of international humanitarian law, etc., is absolutely having a seismic effect on our sector. So how can you try and prevent, preempt, and resolve the second and third order consequences of a perceived lack of empathy in all sectors?
Yeah, thank you. And I'd love to learn more about your experiences, because I know that you're doing some really fascinating work. This to me is, again, it speaks to that importance of it being far more embedded within organizations and within systems and structures, that it's not just reliant on one person, that we start to, the way in which certain processes or aid schemes and initiatives are rolled out take into account these different dimensions that incorporate that empathy, whether strategic or relational, at all the different stages, so that it's not just on one person, that you've got the stops and balances, and the ability to say, well, is it really attuned to what's going on? I know that in your sector there's probably challenges in the funding, and that's really where someone who decides they just don't want to fund something then means that whole areas are withdrawn and support and resources from people. And I don't fully know how you get around that, because that's obviously about encouraging other governments and other people to be able to step up and provide those resources. But for me, it's about changing the broader conversation, not relying on any one person, either with empathy or without, so that it's something that's part of practice. It's part of what we do and how we do it, that takes more people with us and is more inclusive and considerate of what the outcome, so that so that empathy is built into the ends. It's, that it's there as a kind of, how do we bring more people in so it's inclusive at the end? I realize it's probably an imperfect answer, and I'd love to talk to you, because I think you probably have far more on the ground experience of what that would look like in practical terms.
It's Brendan, isn't it? Yes. Yeah.
Sorry.
Quick questions.
Yeah.
17 months and 7 days was midterm. Advice to Democrats in the US on how to win. Secondly, Pope Francis as perhaps the most empathetic person in the world, public empathetic person in the world. How does his legacy, his style survive? And then thirdly, the role of the press and the lack of empathy. Chris Hillman wrote a great piece just before the as a journalist and a politician, we dumb down.
Yeah.
How do we get the press to start reporting instead of making them so?
Thank you. Yeah, 3 big questions there. I'll try. I probably won't do them justice in my answer, because there'll be quick replies in some ways. The first one, the advice for the Democrats ahead of the midterms. I think they need to get out of the bubble, and they need to get into the Midwest. They need to get into those areas that have swung from Democrats to Republicans and really understand what's going on there. I think they also need to start offering a solution. I was a bit disappointed, a lot disappointed in the election, just to see that there wasn't really a plan after the idea. You had a lot of great policy headlines, but then there wasn't really steps and measures for how they were going to make that happen. And I do think there's a need for the Democrats to also consider some of its considers some of the things that it holds up and reveres, whether or not they're working, and whether there's other ways to achieve it. So when you're talking about some of the liberal internationalism, is that really working as you intend? Can you think differently about what might be needed? How do we approach some of the challenges that takes into account diverse perspectives and what's hurting people, especially when it comes to jobs and the economy? On Pope Francis and his legacy, yeah, I think what it shows is that there's an appetite for it. So much of the eulogies of him were about his care, about how he had compassion, about how he was still delivering aid until the very end to people who really needed it. And I think that, to me, shows that there's an appetite that we need more people to take up and think about what was it that he did, lived in integrity with those kind of ideas, spoke about it very openly, and delivered on what he was saying, that it was met by that action. So I think that's part of the legacy. And the third on the media, yeah, I have a chapter in my book on the media because I think it's a critical part of our ecosystem, actually. How do we get them to tell different stories? And unfortunately, right now, the economic model for the media is likes and clicks and snappy headlines. And I would love to see a move towards far more complex and nuanced journalism that didn't just sum things up in a neat way, but actually explained more about the different sides involved. I'd love to see, there's some great organizations. There's an organization called IGAB, which is based in Egypt, and they are very much empowering local journalists. So then it's about going to local sources, having people within their communities tell the story as they want it told, rather than having, someone in the center reflecting on what's going on from afar. And I think even in Australia, local journalism is one way that we tell more stories. The problem right now is that a lot of local journalism is a lot of adverts. It's not necessarily doing what it should and telling stories of communities and local belonging and initiatives. But I think there's a role for the media to tell slower news, to tell longer stories. I personally love long form journalism because I think it gets into the heart of what it's doing, and to try and just avoid this over reductive media narrative. But we also need politicians who can speak to that. We need a different culture of consuming our media and our news that isn't just based on social media, but is, values the longer form and the slower news day. Thank you.
Okay, we've got very little time, but I think we're going to go over time a little bit because there's so many questions. We'll go over here.
Hi. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Really just to provide a different perspective. Mm-hmm. I'm a social psychologist,
mm-hmm.
so I worked for
years.
And I've come across as a psychologist working
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
anything to do with coaching.
Yeah.
And I found that actually this I have to
share
and talk about connection.
Well, that would probably help, wouldn't it? And I just wanted to make an observation that as psychologists, we know that one of the precursors of empathy is a shared social identity.
Mm-hmm.
So where people connect and have a common sense of us,
mm-hmm.
empathy then follows. And it's very difficult,
mm-hmm.
as you reflected on, to try and get people to be empathetic
mm-hmm.
if they don't see that they have much or any similar value, cause,
mm-hmm.
or trajectory, which is why, to your point about having a common experience,
mm-hmm.
in social psychology, we would call that common fate.
Mm-hmm.
Like you see it across the research where people have a common sense of us and a common
mm-hmm.
agenda, which is what Jacinda Ardern
mm-hmm.
did very well. People come together and can empathize. It's almost like the lock that
mm-hmm.
unlocks the empathy. And so I think it's about that sense of connection and belonging is the kind of precursor to make the activities about connecting. There's some really interesting research that shows that if you show communities divergence and diversity by saying, in the UK, look at all the polls in the country or look at all the illegal, if you make people aware of difference, trust decreases. But if you bring people physically together and connect and they share the experience, so if somebody comes around to fix something in your house and they happen to be from Poland and talk about their Polish experiences, trust increases. So it's not just awareness of others, it's actual connection at a psychological level that then unlocks the empathy. So I just think it's quite an interesting perspective on it, but really just to reiterate everything, you know, to say I profoundly agree from a psychological perspective, everything you said. The only other thing is, being also a realistic pragmatist or idealistic pragmatist, is that I think people look down on empathy when they become fearful of actually how powerful it can be.
Yeah.
So at the moment, whilst everyone is slightly disregarding it, it's actually because they can see that there's a huge amount of collective power in empathy that requires hard work, but if it's done properly, can be enormously powerful. So I wonder whether there's a glass half full approach to this, that there's a fear of it because people know that actually it can be tremendously powerful if done properly.
Yeah, thank you so much. They're really valuable observations. And I totally agree on the second point about it being something people are scared of. I think there's real truth to that it makes them uncomfortable because of what potential it holds. And on the first point, I agree as well. I think it's so valuable that people feel this sense of common fate and common purpose. And I was reminded as you were speaking of that Heineken advert, I think from 2017, where they put people of difference in a room together and they get them to build IKEA furniture, which is always guaranteed to cause arguments. You know, and then they don't realize that they're dealing with their political opposite at the same time. And so that common task gets them to then realize that the other person's just like them, which is maybe a more reductive idea of what you're talking about, which is very important. But that similar principle of we're far more reminded of our similarities when we've got a shared task or a shared role, which is undermined right now by that atomization that we're experiencing a little bit in society. Thank you. I really appreciate that.
Okay, we'll have one more over here.
Hi, Claire. Phil, I'm at the Australian War College. I'd just like to go back to your three solutions for increasing empathy. And your first one was incorporating empathy as part of the political ecosystem.
Yeah.
As you went through all those points, for the other two, I could sort of see ways that you could systemize and implement that. But that first one had me a bit stumped. So if you had the resources, the time, and the ability to implement the decisions, how would you go about implementing that ecosystem?
Perfect. Thank you. Yes. And I identified a couple of areas. For me, a lot of it is about there's a number of spaces. So try and think of a couple. The first would be to try and lean into citizens' assemblies more, as I said. So investing resources at a community level of taking key questions to people and asking them to navigate the debates within them. That means you get people from across society of different demographic backgrounds and experiences, and you give them a question. For example, they've had it in the Republic of Ireland successfully over things like abortion. They've done them in France as well on euthanasia. And you take these very problematic questions to people and you say, where do you go? And you'll find that people will have different perspectives, but they're guided by moderators, mediators through that to then find collective solutions. And I think if politicians can engage with that, that really helps. I think there's also scope for politicians going out far more into the community and getting that understanding of how different people are living and experiencing things. There's some really good work being done in policymaking, especially where people are trying to get out more to deal with and engage with frontline workers to really understand when we're designing solutions to the health crisis, to the education crisis, what does it mean for those who are actually delivering on our policy? And so building that interconnectedness into not just political systems and structures, but bureaucratic, organizational approaches, so that empathy becomes part. I always talk about it as an ethos, a practice, and a mindset. It becomes part of the practice of policy and government. I think as well, it's about encouraging politicians and policymakers to be able to communicate more effectively what's actually going on. When I worked in politics, I would get frustrated by the number of just empty sound bites you'd get. One of the favorite in London when I was there was Cloud Cuckoo Land, which means absolutely nothing. And you want politicians who can say, look, this is hard. This is what we're dealing with. These are the numbers. This is the data. This is what we're trying to do. And then can talk through the process of how they're dealing with it so that we move away from this need for very neat, easy solutions to politicians who can take the time and have the courage and emotional maturity to take people on the process and explain that that's part of politics. So building it in that way to political expectations. And I'd also love to see at that kind of systemic level, more bipartisanship. I thought it was notable, again, Albanese reached across the aisle and thanked Peter Dutton went in his acceptance speech, which I think is a good sign, but it has to go beyond that. We see that this is really broken down in America, in countries like the UK right now. There isn't a lot of it. The Labour isn't really keen in working with the Tories or the Lib Dems or Reform. And it would be really good to find certain core issues on which you can get political parties collaborating and getting around a table and saying, look, this has a long-term impact on citizens. How do we work together? We're going to disagree, but what is it that we do agree on? And how do we build on that? And so changing the terms of dialogue, making it a norm rather than an exception. So I don't know if that answers. Yeah, thank you.
Good. Okay, take a seat. Well done.
Thank you.
Okay, allow me to be the first to congratulate you on a wonderful event. And a great talk and a great Q&A session. It's really good to have a sort of a talk on a very conceptual topic that nevertheless is so important to us here at a member organization that fosters a sense of community and therefore hopefully adds to empathy in Australia. So if you could join me in thanking Claire for that wonderful talk.